Welcome to Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Join us as we continue the story of the Bone Scraper, Book 1, The Atlanta Lode, by Zachary Craig Hanson, read by Justin King.
Part 3. Ashes. Chapter 25. Atlanta Chapel. December 24th, 1867. It was mid-morning by the time Jesse was done cleaning up the blood. He had fully removed the man's head and dragged the body a few feet to the base of the altar and covered it with a sheet until he could get help. He knew just who to recruit for the job. His friend, Co Lamb, the father of the young woman who had been slain by Walter. After changing into a fresh set of clothes, he made his way toward Main Street to seek out Co. On his walk, he couldn't stop raising his hands to look at the caked blood that had dried under his fingernails, something he hadn't seen or felt in years. He reveled in the fact that this time the blood belonged to someone who truly deserved to die, and for a moment, he felt peace. That peace lasted less than half a mile, until he saw the commotion of the Asian community swarming around the entrance of Co's apothecary. Jesse knew that they must have found Lynn's broken, assaulted, and lifeless body where Walter had left her the night before. Working his way through the crowd, Jesse fought his way in and caught sight of Co. He and his wife were sobbing over the bruised body of their young and once vibrant daughter. Co never looked up, but felt the hand of his friend Jesse touching his shoulder. Bending down close to Co's ear to avoid being heard by the fellow mourners in the packed room, Jesse said, "Co, I'm sorry for your daughter, but I need you to trust me and come with me." Turning to face Jesse, Co could see the rage and sorrow that had so suddenly hardened the soul of this otherwise kind and gentle man. He could see the seriousness in Jesse's face. Co turned to his wife, whispered something in Chinese, and got up to follow Jesse through the crowd of well-wishers and back out into the street. Once they cleared the mass of onlookers and were out of earshot, Co Lamb spoke. "Ezra told me they found her body in the alley by the bar. Says he thinks mice slid from the roof and knocked her dead," Co said. "I don't understand. She knows not to walk by those places, and she looks like she was beaten. There was blood on her lips." Co's voice cracked, and he began to sob, his body shaking as he continued. "Her pants were torn. Jesse, there was blood between her legs." Co had a hard time finishing what he wanted to say. He was silent for a few minutes as the two men walked together, and then he continued. "Ezra, he said it was an accident. He ignored my pleas. Said someone would look into it after Christmas," Co said, his eyes wide with anguish and disbelief. "Something isn't right, Jesse." Through his tears, Co began to murmur some words in Chinese as Jesse led him down the street and toward the church. As they entered and walked past the pews towards the altar, Co caught sight of the blotchy, discolored wood on the front two pews where Jesse had spent the morning cleaning up the blood of Lynn's killer. Co then shifted his gaze toward the body-shaped lump covered in a brown-stained sheet. "What is this, Jesse?" Co said with a heavier Chinese accent than usual. "Co, this is your daughter's killer." Without hesitation, the distraught father ran to the sheet-covered mass near the altar. He had to see who brutally robbed him of his pride and joy. As Co ripped back the sheet, he found himself staring into the clotted neck hole of a man he couldn't recognize. It took his brain a second to catch up, but as he pulled the sheet further down, he found the head of his worst nightmare. There, frozen in a state of sheer terror and confusion, was Walter Frank. His bloodshot eyes were open and caked with blood. Co stared deep into them with the bitterness of 1,000 men, with a hatred so sharp and jagged that if the dead could burn even hotter in hell, He surely would in that moment. Ko sank into a deep squat. He never put the sheet back over the gory body, but remained locked in a stare-off with his daughter's rapist that could only be fueled by the silent rage of an ailing father. As the contest wore on, Jesse began to speak and relay the saga of that morning to Ko. He relayed the details of Lynn's death the way he had heard it from the vile man who now lay dead and decapitated on the floor. Ko's only reaction in that moment was a slight lip quiver on his grimacing face, as he remained locked onto the eyes of Walter Frank. As Jesse finished his story, he broke Ko's concentration by handing him his Bible, which was turned to the last page. Ko read the names Jesse had listed, and the inscription that followed, and then sat silently in his deep squat, pondering his friend's ordained mission to cull the wolves. Without a word, Ko handed the Bible back to Jesse in an overly respectful way, before turning back to Walter's body. In one swoop, Ko ripped the entire sheet off of the dead man and pulled out the blade that he kept in his waistband. Coming up from his deep squat, the small-statured Ko cut the button off of Walter's pants and pulled them down to expose his genitals. With a few quick slices, Ko cut the stringy radish of a penis off of the man who had raped and murdered his daughter, and then he shoved it into the open mouth of the man's severed head. Without a hint of emotion, his voice steady now, Ko turned to Jesse. "I don't know your God, but if he has ordained you to cure these men, then he is a God of mercy. I'll help you in whatever way I can," he said. "I'll go sit with my wife now, before we take Lynn to the burial site tonight. After dusk, I'll come back. We'll load up this son of a bitch too, and take him away from here." Before he turned to leave, Ko leaned over the body again. He spat in the face of Walter Frank, just as his brave daughter had done, and he saw himself out of the church. Chapter 26. Chinese Burial Ground. Atlanta, Idaho. December 24th, 1867. Ko and Jesse sat silently as the ox cart made the all-too-familiar trip toward the burial ground. And as they neared, Jesse could see the two crosses of his brother and Flora in the moonlight. The reflection of light off of the snow gave her great visibility in the early evening, and the only sounds were those of holiday parties starting up in the distance. Jesse knew the drill by now, and immediately grabbed the spade to help Ko remove snow and turn the earth where so many other Chinese lay. Unlike the bodies of his brother and Flora, the Chinese bodies were not covered in a Christian manner and adorned with the cross. They were laid shoulder to shoulder with other countrymen and showered with just enough dirt to keep the animals at bay. They were aligned in a sequential pattern, so Ko would know who to unbury next in order to start scraping their bones, before returning them to China. Here, too, his daughter would lie while the earth decomposed her corpse, and in 3 years' time, Ko would hold the body of his loved one once again, and scrape away the final remnants in memory of her time on Earth. Once the plot was prepared, Jesse helped Ko get Lynn's body out of the ox cart. As they carried her over to the hole, Jesse caught a glimpse of her bruised face. He looked up toward the bright moon and said a silent prayer to God, giving thanks for the justice he had empowered Jesse to provide for this young girl. As Ko worked through the Taoist tradition of burial, Jesse shifted his mind toward what to do with the body of Walter. He and Ko had briefly discussed that they would dig him a small grave on the outskirts of the burial ground, which would raise no suspicion. With the spade in hand, Jesse found a spot far enough away from the burial site of his loved ones and the resting Chinese, and began to clear the snow before working to break up the hardening ground. Through his sweat, Jesse looked up into the eerily illuminated tree line to see that his omnipresent observer, the gray wolf, was back again. This time, there was a different feeling between the two earthly beasts, a feeling of understanding and calm. The wolf did not run and did not come closer. He merely sat in observance of Jesse, and eventually Ko, preparing the grave for Walter Frank. Once complete, Ko and Jesse took the headless corpse and chucked it into the grave in a face-down position. As Ko picked up Walter's head by its greasy, lice-ridden hair, Jesse stopped him from throwing it into the grave. Instead, Jesse took the head from Co and turned toward the woodline, where Jesse's wolf continued its cautious observation. Walking slowly in the crunching snow through a maze of shadows cast by the ponderosa pines, Jesse made his way closer to the wolf. The wolf held its ground, and its ears perked up at the approaching man. When Jesse got to within 50 yards of the huge animal, he looked down one last time at the pathetic man with his own penis shoved into his mouth, and tossed it as hard as he could into an underhand swing. Walter's head landed perfectly upright in the soft snow about 1/4 of the way between Jesse and the wolf. Had there been any consciousness left in Walter's body, his last earthly memory would have been that of a predatory canine closing in on his helpless face. As Co and Jesse watched the wolf trot off with Walter's head, they both shared a smile that sang of poetic justice. They then covered the remnants of Walter's body, left no cross, and headed back to town so Jesse could prepare for the Christmas service that was planned for the next day. Chapter 27, Atlanta Chapel, December 25th, 1867. At 10 a.m., the town folks of Atlanta began to make their way into the chapel for Jesse's Christmas Day sermon. Once the crowd was at capacity, Jesse opened with a prayer, asking God to bless the recently deceased. And although he did not call them by name, the congregation knew exactly who he was referring to: Flora James and Lynn Lamb. As he opened his eyes at the closing of the prayer, Jesse made direct eye contact with Mr. Cumming, who was seated in the front row, and Tristan Alexander, who was gutsy enough to sneak into the back and stand to elbow with the O'Keefe brothers. These men, who thought they could get away with anything, had no idea what lay beneath the icy gaze of their unassuming preacher. As Jesse began his sermon on the birth of Jesus Christ, he couldn't help but fantasize about ridding the town of several of the men standing in the crowd. It even brought him joy to see the family of Walter Frank sitting in the pew, where their patriarch had taken his last breath. No longer would his wife have to cover the bruises on her face. No longer would his children fear the erratic nature of their violent father. As the memorized sermon came to a close, and the hall began to empty, Jesse noticed that Mr. Cumming and his henchmen had stayed behind. This didn't raise Jesse's heart rate, but his mind did replay the previous day's events, and he wondered if he had slipped up in any way in his effort to dispatch the life of Walter Frank and dispose of the body.
"Nice sermon, Jesse,"
Mr. Cumming said from his hunchbacked position on the front pew.
"I'm glad to see you got my message and stop opening your doors to the degenerates of this town."
The only degenerates I know of will soon be gone, Jesse thought.
"Listen, I know you're close with that coolie Co, and I know he just lost his daughter, but he still has to pay me on time,"
Mr. Cumming continued.
"You may be wondering why I'm telling you this. Well, since the two of you are so close and all, I've decided I'm gonna roll your loans together. If he's late, and you're late too."
Mr. Cummings paused and audibly cleared his throat.
"Can't have him slowing down businesses just 'cause his daughter got herself in over her head,"
he said.
"Well, she was probably asking for that ice to fall on her."
Mr. Cumming ended with a chuckle, and it took every ounce of restraint in Jesse's body not to strangle the man with his bare hands. As the greedy man wrapped up his little speech, he lifted his frail frame from the pew, patted Jesse sarcastically on the shoulder, and turned to leave, flanked by Jim and John O'Keefe. As they exited through the front doors, Mr. Cumming shouted over his shoulder,
"Merry Christmas, preacher man!"
Just minutes after those wretched men left the house of God, Jesse got to work. Though largely seen as mild-mannered, Jesse was well versed in the ways of death. His exceptional career in the army had ensured that, and he was known for detailed planning. This current mission from God, in his mind, was no different than planning for battle, except this time there would be no innocent victims. Only the putrid scum that stained the brightness of humanity would be blighted into ensuing salvo. To avoid raising suspicion, Jesse knew he would have to spread out his attacks over the next several days, and he would need to focus on each man's individual habits to determine the best way to draw them into his web. As he sketched out his initial thoughts, He jotted down what he knew about each man. Jim O'Keely, his brother's killer, frequented the Chinese gambling and opium house. John O'Keely rode along each morning to collect money from the greenback mining operation. And Tristan Alexander spent most of his time amongst the horrors of Slippery Gulch. Mr. Cumming, the puppeteer and instigator of much of the sinful ways of this town, was more of a shut-in, and he would be the hardest to draw out, especially if his two guard dogs, the O'Keelys, went missing. The operation would be complicated, at best, and Jesse knew he would need help. He knew that he had Coe's blessing and could leverage his store to secure mercury, chloroform, and other potions, as needed to help take care of the O'Keely brothers. But for Tristan Alexander, he would need help from one of the women who worked in Slippery Gulch. As he began to ponder how to make a connection in that world he knew nothing about, Jesse felt the light of the Lord bringing clarity to his thoughts. He bolted from his seat and climbed the ladder to his loft above the sanctuary. At the foot of his bed was a small locker. Jesse flung it open and picked up the blood-stained photo and letter that his love, Flora, had held in her dying moments, and reread the inscription on the back of the photo. "Dearest sister, I am so sorry to hear about all your troubles as of late. I'm saddened to hear of Robert's untimely disappearance, but I am glad you have found a friend, Emily, to confide in. I surely can't imagine what you must be going through with the anniversary of your daughter's death approaching this July, and I hope she can help console you. We are praying for you, and I have no doubt a great man will come soon to sweep you off your feet. We all miss you here in Baton Rouge, although it is as hot as it has ever been. And hope to see you one day, and to once again taste your famous roux. With love, Annabelle." In the short few months he had been living in Atlanta, Jesse had not come across a single person in town or in his congregation named Emily. But he had often heard of the madam who ran the brothel. They called her Dutch M. Jesse wondered if Dutch M could be the Emily Flora had befriended. It must be, he thought. Just as Jesse was, Flora had been drawn to the downtrodden. She had sought them out for fellowship and conversation. If Dutch M really had been friends with Flora, she may be the key in helping Jesse avenge the death of her friend, the lover he never got to marry. Chapter 28, Slippery Gulch, Atlanta, Idaho, December 26, 1867. It was early morning the day after Christmas when Jesse crossed the threshold into the small red light district of Atlanta, Idaho. Slippery Gulch was the area just west of town, where the destitute women and widows congregated and built ramshackle buildings to put up a facade of privacy for the women entrapped in the world's oldest profession. As Jesse walked along a small path through the non-linear assortment of buildings, the snow and cooler temperatures maxed the stink that often emanated from those cells. Not knowing where he was going, he worked his way toward one of the larger buildings nestled in the back corner of the row houses that had smoke rising from the chimney. He approached the front door. More nervous now than he had been at any point during his time in Atlanta, Jesse pushed the door open to reveal a bevy of bleary-eyed women sitting around in nightgowns, preparing what looked like coffee. "Sorry, we ain't open for business right now. Come back tonight if you're looking for a lady." One of the women scowled through a yawn. "I'm looking for Dutch M, ma'am," Jesse said, nearly whispering. "Is she here?"
Who in the hell is asking? Say, ain't you that preacher man?
Barked one of the snaggletooth women with a bed of frizzy red hair. Another one of the women, who looked to be in her 40s, chimed in with a chuckle as she took a drag off a hand-rolled cigarette.
"I guess everyone still needs to get their rocks off," she said. "God can do a lot of things, but I guess he can't jerk you off, huh, preacher man?"
Jesse blushed. "No, ma'am," he sputtered, his voice cracking. A sound he hadn't heard since puberty. "That's not why I'm here."
"Sure, whatever you say, man,"
the frizzy-haired woman said with a wink.
"Listen, you just sit here and relax. Rose will fetch Dutch M for you."
Jesse did as he was instructed as a gaggle of women sized him up in short order. Feeling more uncomfortable by the minute, he was relieved when the woman of middle age entered the room. Assuming it was Dutch M, he got up and closed the distance between them. "Emily?" he asked, without making any kind of introduction.
"That's me. Most call me Dutch M, though. I presume you're here to talk about Flora."
Simultaneously relieved and excited, Jesse couldn't help but smile at the thought of his love, that perhaps she was still looking out for him beyond the grave. "Come on," said Dutch M. "Let's go into my office." Dutch M's office was more of a closet, but it served its purpose in providing privacy for the two to converse. Opening the conversation, Jesse explained that after Flora's passing, he had kept the note she had clung to in her final moments. Pulling out the picture with the letter written on the back, Jesse described how Flora's sister had mentioned an Emily as a confidant that had brought comfort to Flora. Jesse went on to say that even after reading the letter hundreds of times, he could not think of a single Emily in the town, and figured that Flora's sister had made a mistake. It wasn't until last night that he made the connection to the infamous Dutch M that now sat before him. Smiling from ear to ear at the mere mention of Flora, Dutch M began, "Flora, what a sweet woman. After her husband left and never returned, she got bold and took long walks through all parts of town, unfazed by any danger that might have lurked. For weeks she would walk past our establishment, smile and wave." Dutch M paused, grinning with an obvious affinity for Flora. "This was bizarre to all of us. Most town folk won't even make eye contact with us, let alone wave," she continued. "Eventually my curiosity got the better of me, and I waved her up to my doorstep. Ever the effusive little thing, she opened her heart to me and treated me like a human being, and not just some whore." Jesse listened intently to every word the woman said, warmed by the thought of it all. "That kind soul came to sit and chat with me and the girls nearly every day," Dutch M continued through watery eyes. "We learned about her past, her tragedies, and most recently we learned a lot about you, Jesse." She told Jesse that Flora had gone on and on about how she had finally met the man she was supposed to be with, and how endearingly peeved Flora was about how much probing it took before Jesse would make a move. Dutch M said she and the other ladies ribbed her for falling in love with a preacher, but they were so glad to see her happy. "Jesse, Flora was wildly in love with you." Jesse was gobsmacked. He hadn't expected to hear such sweet words. He had come in search of a willing accomplice to murder after all, but Dutch M's words only strengthened his resolve. "So, you found out I was close with your Flora," she said. "What's next? You gonna try to bring me to the Lord?" Jesse was so unsure as to how to broach the request that lurked within him, and he had not practiced the delivery of his pitch. So without another thought, he blurted it out. "I need you to help me kill Tristan Alexander." The ensuing silence twisted knots in Jesse's stomach, not because he was afraid of being turned into Sheriff Hot, but because if he did get caught, he would miss out on fulfilling his duty to God. Fortunately, the smile didn't last long. A smile worked its way onto Emily's face, exposing the dimples that had previously hid beneath her serious demeanor. "That son of a bitch," she said. Her smile widened and she shook her head. "Flora fretted about him always coming on to her at the hotel, and I always told her to keep clear of him," Emily said. "He spends a lot of nights with my girls and he roughs them up. Most guys do, pent-up frustration and all, but Tristan takes it too far. Most of my girls would jump at the chance to string that piece of shit up by his balls. Pardon my language." Seeing the seriousness in Jesse's face, Dutch M asked him one simple question. "So, what do you have in mind?" Chapter 29. Slippery Gulch Brothel, December 26, 1867. Tristan Alexander was feeling invincible. He had murdered the wretched bitch who turned him down, and had somehow managed to avoid punishment for the crime he openly committed. His snowy steps as a free man in the red light district on the day after Christmas felt better than any before. This night, like most, he was ready to spend his meager pay on the thrill of spending a few hours with his favorite girl, roughing her up, and slinking back toward the squalid tent he called home on the east side of town. But when Tristan showed up to the brothel this particular evening, he was greeted with a proposition from the madam herself, Dutch M. This had never happened before, as Dutch M had retired since taking over the establishment for Peg Leg Annie over a year ago. This offer from such an attractive, experienced woman, who had enough money to avoid betting even the best-looking men in town if she wished, should have struck Tristan as odd. But his hubris and ego were so inflated that he assumed Dutch M was actually interested in him. As he followed the scent of Emily's perfume into a downstairs room he had never been to, what Tristan did not know was that between the room divider awaited Jesse Waite, grasping a thick sheet of cheesecloth and a bottle of chloroform, while Co Lamb sat at the ready with his ox cart at the rear of the building. As Tristan took in the surroundings of the unfamiliar room, Jesse felt his heart rate quicken as he prepared himself to witness the exchange between a man and woman during a carnal transaction. Sitting at the ready with the medicine that knocked out many a young man waiting amputation during the war, he waited to carry out the plan that he, Emily, and Co. had created the day before. "Oh, wait!" snarled Tristan with a hint of bravado, emboldened by his pre-meet of whiskey. "I thought you was in retirement," he said, snapping his suspenders with his dirty thumbs. "Guess you heard about me from the other gals and wanted to get you a taste." "You know it, baby. I heard you like it rough, and I haven't been manhandled in a long time," Emily whispered, moving past Tristan and toward the bed. Perched on all fours, she turned her head to look back at the balding, muscular miner and bit her lower lip. She lifted her nightdress then to expose her bare bottom to the now salivating Tristan. "Come on then," she teased. "Show me what you got." And she buried her face in the horsehair pillow at the head of the bed. Tristan undid his suspenders with more swagger than necessary and pulled down his pants. With no thought of foreplay, he grabbed Emily's hips aggressively and drove himself inside of her, which prompted her to let out her best feigned moan. That moan was a sign that she and Jesse had agreed upon. It was his signal to pour chloroform onto the rag in his hand. He would then wait until Tristan was a few pumps in before quietly emerging from behind the room divider, placing the rag over Tristan's mouth from behind, and then lowering him to the ground as he drifted off into dreamland. But as a severe thrusting and slapping of skin took place, Jesse stumbled over something on the floor as he emerged from his hiding spot. At the sound of Jesse's foot slamming into whatever debris was laying there, Tristan instinctively pulled out of Emily in mid-thrust and turned around in a fright. "What the fuck?" Tristan said as a lamplight flickered, revealing Jesse's gnarled and angry face. Despite the awkwardness of the naked man standing out in front of him, Jesse's rage at seeing his lover's murderer face to face overtook him, and he pounced onto Tristan like a mountain lion taking down an elk. The force of impact drove the pantless Tristan onto the bed right beside Dutch M, as Jesse forced the rag over Tristan's mouth and nose. Although his legs were still caught up in his own pants, he exerted a few heavy mule kicks before falling still and silent, indicating that he was out cold. As the adrenaline of the struggle wore off, Jesse realized he was sitting on top of the naked man's chest, and that Dutch M was still right beside him on all fours, her full rear exposed. Emily looked at Jesse for a moment. She looked at the unconscious man beside her, then went and pulled her gown back down over her legs. "That one was for Flora," she said. "Let's go." The pair climbed off the bed and jointly pulled the pants up over the foul-smelling groin of the man they had just attacked. Jesse figured they had about 45 minutes before they would need to reapply chloroform, which would be plenty of time for them to play out their plan. As Jesse repositioned Tristan on the bed, Dutch M opened the door in the back of the room, which let in a cold rush of winter air. Out of the darkness sat Co, at the helm of his ox cart, waiting for the signal from Emily. At the wave of her friendly hand, Co hurried inside to help lift the large body of Tristan Alexander. With swift precision, Emily took hold of Tristan's left foot, Co took hold of his right, and Jesse lifted the man's torso by reaching under both of his arms. Undetected, and with the cover of night in the farthest corner of the slippery gulch, they lifted Tristan into the back of the covered ox cart that they had carried so many people to their final resting place. Once they had ungracefully hucked the body into the back of the cart, Jesse pulled himself up and into the wagon to sit with the unconscious body, while Co worked his way back to the front seat. As Jesse sat there waiting to feel the cart lurch forward toward their final destination, he saw Emily's hand shoot into his view, indicating that she wanted help getting into the cart. Coming to his knees, Jesse stuck his head out of the rear burlap cover of the wagon. "Em, you don't need to come with us for this part," he said. "Thank you for all your help." "The hell with that," she shouted back. "I want to see the look on this son of a bitch's face as he dies." Unable to retort with anything that would drive Dutch M away, Jesse relented and helped her into the back of the cart, just as Ko got the oxen moving in a westward direction. The journey was short, about half a mile from Main Street where the rest of the town was still partying hard. The trio pulled up to one of the old arrastras that had been used in the crushing of ore when the town was first established. On arrival, they were greeted by Jesse's horse, who was staged there a few hours earlier, out of sight in the woodline just behind the arastra. With no one nearby, and being on the Chinese side of town, the group felt comfortable with their choice of location, and scrambled out of the wagon to convene at the rear of the cart. Together, they pulled Tristan out with the same lack of care in which they had loaded him, and placed him on the snowy ground up against the low rock wall of the arastra. Jesse reached under Tristan's arms once again to drag his body into the center of the stone pit. While awkwardly positioning Tristan's body, he took a rope and tied his hands and feet up around the center post of the arastra, and then wrapped up another piece of rope around his mouth to keep him from screaming when he eventually woke up. Ko, meanwhile, was hooking Jesse's horse up to the crossbeam that reached outside of the inner circle where they sat. Now that Jesse had the vile man restrained, he took out his knife and prepared to do the intricate work that would make this death a miserable one. Lifting Tristan's shirt to expose his lower abdomen, Jesse made a horizontal cut about 4 inches in from his right hip bone. Having involuntarily studied the grotesque anatomy of many wartime surgeries, Jesse knew what he was going for, and once he made the incision, he reached inside Tristan just like he would a gutted deer. Wrist deep inside of his victim, Jesse swam his hand around the warm crimson soup until he found the cylindrical tube of the small intestine. Following it down to his lower end, he then plunged his other hand into the wound he had created and cut the sponge-like intestine with his knife. Holding on to the raw end tightly, so as to avoid it being lost inside of Tristan's abdomen, he pulled it out of the original incision he had made. Pulling out just enough intestinal slack, about 2 feet, he motioned for Ko to pass him the small hammer and nail. Right above them was the opposite end of the crossbeam connected to Jesse's horse, where the dragstone would normally be attached. Yet tonight, there was no dragstone to crush ore, just a small intestine of a wicked man tacked with a hammer and nail to the beam. With their device set, Jesse helped Emily up and into the saddle of his horse, while he and Ko sat patiently on the rock's edge, waiting for Tristan to wake up from his anesthesia. 10 minutes passed before the first flutter of Tristan's eyes indicated that he was in fact still alive. From that first flutter, the chloroform wore off in a quick manner, and the trio could see the terror overtake his troll-like facial features. First, his eyes widened so far that it looked as though his eyelids may not be able to contain them. Through the waves of pain, confusion, and shock visually crashed over him as his frightened gaze shot to each of the people standing there. The group let him writhe a bit and enjoyed watching him fight the restraints before the pain took over, and he finally looked down at his stomach. His eyes followed what looked like a pale snake emanating from his abdomen, rising about 2 feet above his head, and nailed to the crossbeam of the arastra. Not understanding what he was looking at, he let out an anguished moan and hung his head a bit before once again trying unsuccessfully to shake free of his restraints. Jesse bent down toward Tristan and recited the verse that had called them into action, and whispered to the whimpering man, "This is for Flo. Every single painful inch that we pull out of you is for her." With those words, Jesse gave Dutch Em a nod. Slowly, she walked the gelding forward, which precipitated a gradual turning of the crossbeam attached to Tristan's intestines. Still not comprehending what was happening, Tristan looked directly at Dutch Em with a scowl on his brow. But the scowl was short-lived once he looked down and realized that the crossbeam moving across his head was attached to his small intestine, which was being pulled out of his stomach. With that revelation, Tristan once again took the writhing and screaming against the rope in his mouth. Biting down hard not to cry and overcome the pain, Tristan began to sob. Yet his tears did nothing to stop the horse that Dutch Em rode in slow and intentional circles, until Tristan was fully wrapped in a thin cocoon of his own internal organs. Left panting and with labored breath, Tristan was still alive as the last of his small intestine was ripped from his body, curled in a fetal position in the center of the arastra. His exposed wound and organs exuded a surprising amount of steam as his warm insides mixed with the freezing late December air. As the steam bellowed off of his body, Jesse stepped back into the center of the arastra as a heavier snow began to fall, and much like Flora's last view of Tristan, Jesse's face appeared, ghost-like through the steam. Without breaking eye contact with Tristan, Jesse delivered one quick and deep slash to the throat of his lover's killer, following through on his promise to God of brutal retribution. With ice in his veins, Jesse wiped the blood from his hands and his own pants and walked over to his horse. Reaching into his saddlebag behind where Dutch M was seated, he pulled out his Bible and a pen, opening the holy book to the last page and resting it on the flanks of his horse. He used the moonlight to guide his hand as he crossed out another name on his list. Tristan Alexander. Chapter 30. Atlanta Chapel. December 27th, 1867. Jesse, Co, and Emily had agreed the night before that they would all convene at the church the next day before sunrise to discuss their next steps. This came after they buried the disemboweled body of Tristan near Walter Frank and fed his entrails to Jesse's wolf. Though the night was short and restless, Jesse was greeted in the pre-dawn light by Co and Dutch M, silently making their way into the sanctuary. Both Co and M understood that they needed to sneak in under the cover of darkness, or else run the risk of Mr. Cumming thinking that more degenerates were making use of the church he had funded. With the small flicker of light emanating from the centrally parked wood-burning stove, Co, Emily, and Jesse sat facing one another amongst the pews. None of them made any references to the actions of the night before, and the silence was only broken by Dutch M cracking a joke about having never been inside of a church. Once M opened the dialogue, the tone once again turned serious, as Jesse noted that their next two targets were John and Jim O'Keely. The problem with these two was that they were almost always traveled together, and were well armed and enjoyed a fight, and a fight is exactly what Jesse wanted to avoid. As the group sat discussing the brothers' normal habits and patterns, Co had an idea.
"Listen, Jesse, Jim spends almost every Friday night in the gambling house, which is where he shot your brother,"
Co said.
"His brother, John, always almost turns in before him because he has to run his money route on Saturday morning at first right. What if we waited for John to arrive, and I could run in and tell Jim that his brother had an accident?"
Jesse and Emily traded a few looks that seemed to say, "This is a good idea," and continued to listen as Co went on.
"The bone-scraping parlor is out back, and I could tell him we helped sit his brother down inside. Once we get him inside, you could take over," he said, looking at Jesse. "I'll shut the door and wait in front with my cart, but we would have to get John the next morning while he runs his route. If he gets done and doesn't see his brother by then, he will turn the town upside down looking for him."
The group seemed okay with the risk, and all agreed that this evening would be the end for Jim O'Keely, and his brother John would follow in short order. For the next hour, the three sat plotting the demise of the corrupt and despicable brothers. Retribution was coming. Chapter 31. Chinese Gambling and Opium House. Atlanta, Idaho, December 27th, 1867. The last Friday night of the year was a special time for many in town. It was the last chance for everyone to let loose before the new year crept up on them. For those who were brave enough to spend time in the gambling hall, the celebration was punctuated by intense card games and a billiards tournament that always seemed to end in a fight or gunshots. As the evening closed in, Jesse grew concerned. The snow from the previous week had given way to bluebird days, followed by bright nights illuminated by the moon and snow. His aim was to remain inconspicuous, and the bright night would add an element of danger, as anyone could potentially spot him and Jim coming to and from the gambling house and bone-scraping parlor. Regardless, the team was ready, and Jesse had already set up his method of attack in the bone-scraping parlor well before the party across the back alley had even begun to kick off. As Jesse sat alone amongst the bones of so many men, women, and children, those who truly helped build this town, Jesse felt a sense of pride in what he was doing. He was on a crusade to abolish the abusers and ne'er-do-wells who looked down on anything and anyone different than themselves. These thoughts raced through his head as he slowly rolled 2 marble billiard balls in his hands. The slow clanking of marble on marble sedated Jesse until his thoughts drifted far off from where he was currently sitting. It went like this for hours, until Co's voice cut through the silence and told Jesse that he had about 10 minutes before he could expect the muscular guard dog of Mr. Cumming, Jim, to walk through the threshold and into Jesse's web and venomous bite. Jim and John O'Keely were brought up in violence. The fraternal twin brothers were born in East Tennessee and raised by a drunken father after they lost their mother in an accidental domestic altercation. At the age of 15, the two boys split on their old man and worked their way across the country and out into the Indian Nation. They ran the gambit of jobs, from loggers, scouts, and eventually bounty hunters. Once the war back east broke out a few years into their travels, they decided to keep pushing west, as they seemed to hold no allegiance to a flag and have come from the oft-despised Nickajack region of the South. Eventually, they found themselves in the Rocky Bar, the capital seat of Alturas County, and got the itch, like most others, for gold. They took up placer mining but saw little luck, and eventually found that their best skill at hardly 20-somethings was beating and robbing people after having too much to drink. As word of the gold lode across James Creek Pass started to spread, the industrious Mr. Cumming, who himself had just arrived in Rocky Bar, took a keen eye to the two young men. He knew that in his fragile state and with his surmountable wealth, he would need protection. So, over the course of a few weeks, he began to court the boys with whiskey, women, and conversations of getting rich. Pretty quickly he had the two hook, line, and sinker, and eventually set out with them for the new town being called Atlanta. And for the past 3 years, the two brothers were loyal to Mr. Cumming. He provided them with an iota of fatherly direction, but more importantly, he provided them with money and status, something neither of them had ever had in their lives. In exchange, they were willing to do whatever Mr. Cumming wanted, including killing anyone who dared to cross him or otherwise stroke his ire. Yet the killing often reached outside the bounds of Mr. Cumming's business dealings, and the two brothers spiraled into what could only be described as killing for sport. If someone so much as looked at them wrong after they had a few drinks, there was a distinct possibility they would be catching a bullet from one of the men's smoothbore pistols. It was that exact scenario in which Jesse's brother had found himself earlier in the year, while playing cards with the O'Keely brothers, which ultimately led to his demise. But, as John and Jim pulled chairs out of their favorite card table on the final Friday of 1867, neither of them knew that atonement for all their sins would soon be knocking hard on their door. The evening in the gambling hall was going as anyone would have expected. In the lamplight haze of cigarette smoke, men were arguing, exchanging money, and drinking heavily. Jim was a poker aficionado and loved to play with other, less experienced miners and would clean them of most of their money. His slightly larger-framed brother John was not as interested in the game and would often sit against the wall and watch over the players, jumping in to break up or end fights that would begin at his brother's table. Tonight was no different than most, and Jim found himself on a real hot streak. So much so that some of those at his table believed he was cheating, and started to become noticeably irate. Jim seemed to get off on the confrontation, and egged his table mates on by boisterously claiming that beating them was a cakewalk, and if they had a modicum of intellect, they wouldn't be walking away empty-handed. This prompted one of the drunken players to stand up and threaten Jim, brandishing his pistol, and demanding that he refund his money, or else. Unfazed by the man's threats, Jim sat there with a shit-eating grin, which only served to encourage the miner to cock his weapon to try and cement his seriousness. However, John O'Keely had been watching for over an hour, anticipating an altercation like this. So by the time the man had first stood up and brandished his firearm, John had casually walked over to the nearby billiard table and borrowed one of the custom oak pool cues that were leaning up against the wall. As Jim continued to smile down the barrel of this man's gun, John cracked the cue over the man's head, sending him crashing into the table. In the fall, he dropped his gun, and both hands landed on the table out in front of Jim. With lightning-fast reflexes, Jim pulled out a small penknife from his pocket and drove it into the top of the splayed-out miner's hand, affixing him to the table. In that moment, Jim's demeanor turned from jovial to demonic as he grabbed the miner's hair to lift his now bloodied head up just enough to lock eyes with him.
"Don't ever accuse me of cheating again," he spat. "Now get the fuck out of here!"
Jim removed the penknife from the miner's hand, and the gentleman rolled off the table to the ground. After taking a few seconds to collect himself, the miner got off and scurried out the front door toward Main Street with his friends, cupping his hand like a wounded dog. With that type of occurrence considered normal, the quietness that hung over the room soon dissipated, as Chinese card dealers once again began to deal, and the drinks continued to flow. As the noise of the room refilled the air, John walked over to where his brother was still sitting. "Hey, listen, Jim, I'm going to call it tonight. I've had enough action for the evening, and I gotta be up early to run my route. Try not to get into any more trouble." Jim gave his brother an approving nod, and watched as he downed his final drink of the evening. Then, as predicted by Ko, John exited out the back door, and began his not-so-long walk back to their dwelling on the outskirts of town. When Ko saw John leave, he did as promised and went to give Jesse the 10-minute warning. As soon as Jesse got the word, he began to focus more intently than he had in a long time, and said a prayer asking God to guide his hand while delivering the justice that he had required as atonement. The whole evening's plan hinged on Ko's ability to execute a story that would convince Jim O'Keefe to step into a trap. Ko took a few deep breaths, and as he walked into the dimly lit hall, he scanned the rooms in search of Jim's table. By the time he found it, Jim was already 2 hands into a new game with a different set of gamblers. Ko quietly shuffled up next to him and whispered into his ear, hoping not to alarm the other players.
"Jim, it's your brother. I saw him walk out the back and then sit down first,"
Ko said.
"I went to check on him, and he seemed confused. I helped him up and gave him some water in my parlor. You may want to check on him."
"Aye, that son of a bitch," Jim replied. "I was just getting warmed up here." He turned to look at Ko and then shook his head. "Right, fine, let's go." Jim turned to his tablemates and told them he would be right back, and to hold his spot while he went to check on something, and with that, the pair made their way out the back door and into the clear late December night. The cold air seemed to sober up Jim, and he took on a melancholy tone as he and Ko walked a short distance to the bone-scraping parlor. "Yeah, no, coolly. These piles of bones really creep me the hell out," he said with a shudder. "I don't get why you gotta unbury these bodies and scrape 'em up. They ain't gonna know." With a half-smile, Jim turned to walk up the 2 small steps into the parlor, and then vanished through the threshold. As he disappeared, Ko immediately turned, took stock to see if anyone was around, and then ran to get his ox cart. Jesse was standing at the ready on the right side of the door, when the broad-shouldered Jim stepped through. You could see that Jim's eyes were having trouble adjusting to the low light, as he scanned the room for his sickly brother. Yet, as the door swung closed behind him, Jim was met by a hand cupping the back of his neck, and a billiard ball being shoved into his mouth with the force of a crashing 6-pound crossbeam hammer. As the marble ball crashed through his front teeth, small white chips flew to the ground, followed by drops of blood. The shock of the attack sent Jim to the floor, as his mind tried to catch up to what was happening. As he fell, Jesse pounced on him, both legs straddling his waist, as he delivered another strike with the cue ball still in his hand. This time, the ball struck Jim's nose, which sent more blood and mucus around the room, splotching the perfectly bleached bones to their left. As Jesse reared back to deliver a third blow, Jim's brain fired on all cylinders and sent him into fight mode. He threw his right arm up to block Jesse's attempted downward strike. Then, with one swift move, Jim's strong left arm found its home under Jesse's right armpit. With a maneuver that caught Jesse off guard, Jim was able to lift Jesse off the ground and flip him onto his back, with a level of strength that Jesse had never felt before. In the blink of an eye, the roles had been reversed, and Jesse found himself with Jim sitting atop him, ready to rain down blows. But as he braced for impact, he was instead met with Jim's entire upper body crashing down on top of him with dead weight. Confused, Jesse pushed the now limp and bloodied body off of him and sat up to see Dutch Em standing over both of them with a cast-iron skillet in her right hand. "I swear all you men are useless," she said, shaking her head. She turned to look back out the door of the parlor then. "Come on now, get yourself up. Ko's pulling up with the cart." Jesse took stock of the situation as he lay there next to the man who had killed his brother, regained his breath, wiped the thick mucousy blood from his face, and sat up. He then went out to meet the others on the front stoop, who were both hawkishly looking for any looky-loos who may be drunkenly waltzing around the alleys. The coast was clear, so Ko opened the back flap of the cart, and the 3 walked in to grab the body. As Jesse once again crossed the threshold, he turned slightly to the right where the body should have been and realized it was gone. Instinctively, he turned around to see Emily, who was coming in behind him. But Jim O'Keefe, alive, pissed off, and disoriented, had snatched her up by the waist. The barely conscious Jim had grabbed Dutch Ann and brandished his pistol, which now rested squarely against her temple. Coe had entered by then too, and through the darkness of the room, he and Jesse exchanged a look of sheer panic. To her credit, Emily remained calm and stoic as she felt a tight grip of Jim cinched around her waist. Standing behind Emily, Jim tried desperately to bark orders at Jesse and Coe, but the strikes from the billiard ball had hindered his ability to speak. As he became more frustrated, he jiggled his gun near Emily's head in an attempt to convey his message as more blood and mucus spewed out from his shattered jaw. God showed up for Jesse once again. As Jim grew weaker and weaker, his legs began to quiver. He no longer had the strength to hold himself up, let alone handle his own gun or keep hold of Dutch M's waist. His grip loosened, setting Emily free, and he collapsed to the floor. In a fear-induced rage, Jesse grabbed the largest femur in the stack of bones that lined the wall right next to him and darted over to the whimpering Jim O'Keefe. With a few deft swings of the bone, Jesse delivered the final blows to finish off Jim, splattering blood onto the dress and shoes of his two stone-faced accomplices, Emily and Coe. Looking up from his kneeled position, bloody club in hand, Jesse said in a loud whisper, "That was a close one."
"Sure was,"
Emily said, readjusting her rumpled and twisted dress.
"Too damn close for comfort."
She looked at Coe and then at Jesse.
"Let's try this again," she added. "Drop your caveman club and grab his arms. We'll get his feet. Let's get this miserable fucker in the ground. Pardon my language, preacher man."
Jesse and Coe did as they were told, and shuffled the body out the door, and immediately into the back of the ox cart. With a crack of Coe's whip, the crew rolled off in the snow, past the bustling back door of the gambling hall, and towards Jim's final resting place in the woods, next to Walter and Tristan. Chapter 32. Greenback Mine Trail. Atlanta, Idaho, December 28th, 1867. Jesse was tired. It had only been a few hours since they had finished dumping and covering Jim's body on the outskirts of China Basin. Yet the grizzled crew were preparing in the pre-dawn light to take out Jim's brother in a quick follow-on attack. As Coe had said earlier, John would be visiting the Greenback Mine to collect the week's payment from Mr. Cummings. Leveraging this knowledge of John's Saturday morning ritual, Jesse had decided to employ an old tactic he had learned back in the war. Once they would use whenever there were impending cavalry charges through the woods: trip mines. Knowing the narrow, winding trail that John would take, Jesse led the bleary-eyed Coe and Emily to a specific tight turn in the path. At its narrowest, it was about 3 feet wide, with large, deciduous trees on either side, which would act as perfect anchors and cover for the waiting team. Jesse pointed out that as John came trotting down the path, he would make a tight turn, get caught by the wire that would hang, and be knocked off his horse, which is when Jesse would spring into action. With only the waning moonlight to light his way, Jesse leaned the ladder against one of the trees lining the path and climbed up to just over 6 feet. In his hand he held a ream of piano wire from the same spool that had garroted Walter Frank, which he started to wrap around the body of the tree. He passed it off to Coe, who helped guide it around the backside of the tree before handing it off to Jesse. Once they had one anchor point completed, they took a few short steps across the trail and repeated the process on a tree opposite the first. What remained was a nearly invisible line of taut and sturdy wire that would surely knock any rider from his perch if he came through with a modicum of speed. And according to Coe, John always liked to get this job done quickly, and was never seen riding slower than a trot. Flicking the now erect cable with his finger and producing an audible twang, Jesse looked at the others from his ladder with a smile barely visible in the soft morning light. "We aren't taking any chances this time. We're gonna make this one quick."
"You damn well better,"
Emily jabbed mid-yawn.
"I ain't saving your ass again this time, Jesse."
"Listen, you just stay awake," he said. "John should be riding through here in the next hour or two. I'll be leaned up against this tree, blocked from his view. The second I hear the crash, I'll be ready. You two be down on the trail by the car. Once you hear the commotion, be ready. I'll walk down the trail to signal you once it's done." Coe and Emily were once again awash with seriousness, reflecting an understanding of their parts in this tragic play. Satisfied with each other's roles, Jesse climbed down from his ladder and handed it off to Coe to carry back to the wagon. In exchange, Co handed Jesse the finishing weapon they had decided on, a Cherokee tomahawk that Jesse had carried with him throughout the war and his travels. It had been a gift from his reluctant father-in-law after he and Enos got married, and was a tool that Jesse had used for clearing brush, chopping wood, and for protection, but it was one he had never used to take a man's life. But, given the necessary silence of the task at hand, he thought it would be fitting to rewet the blade with the blood of a white man, like the Cherokee people had intended when they crafted it. Leaning up against the tree, Jesse did his best to keep warm in the few inches of snow that covered the ground. He occasionally straightened one leg, then the other, but he was so focused on being still that the numbness would regularly overtake his legs, without warning. These exercises halted as rays of sunlight crept through the treetops to the east, casting a perfect shadow over his hiding spot. The light now warming his body was his indication that it was time to meditate and pray. With the tomahawk in his right hand, he began to focus on the deer leather straps hanging off the shoulder of the axe. It had brightly colored beads attached to it, and inserted into those beads were 2 crow feathers that dangled down and over his right wrist. With his left hand, he thumbed the stone blade. He recited his verse of retribution from Deuteronomy, and prayed for God to guide his hand. In the silence of the winter morning, Jesse finally made out the distant sound of a man on horse, which whipped him out of his meditation and heightened his senses. Sitting against a tree like a stone, Jesse's ears began to ring as the rider closed the distance toward the trap. Jesse shook his legs out one last time before squeezing the throat of his tomahawk with a strength that would have broken weaker wood. As planned, Jesse could hear John coming down the trail at a gallop as his horse's hooves cut through the snow. As John neared the sharp turn that would put him on a collision path with the wire, Jesse arose into a low squat that reminded him of the prisoner he had watched wither away and die at Andersonville. He prepared to attack. As John rounded the corner, he spurred his horse hard to gain speed, and without warning, he found himself on his back with the wind knocked out of him. The impact of John's chest into the wire had snapped it clean, and shaken the 2 trees so hard that the snow adorning its upper limbs came crashing down. That shower of snow, followed by the sounds of the body impacting the earth and the whinny of John's baffled horse, sent Jesse into action. Rounding the base of the tree, Jesse locked eyes with a confused and pained John, who had no idea what awaited him. With less than a few feet of distance to cover, Jesse lifted the tomahawk above his head and let out an emphatic war cry before bringing the blade down with the full force of his body and gravity. From his perpendicular approach to John's supine position, the stone blade cut directly across his temple and both eyes. The force of the blow implanted the tool several inches into John's skull, and was so tightly lodged that Jesse couldn't easily pull it out for another strike, but it didn't matter, as evidenced by the twitching of his hands and feet as blood, drool, and brain matter began to pool under his head. John O'Keely was dead. Within minutes, Jesse looked down the path where his friends had been waiting and saw Emily walking up the trail, leading John's horse by the reins. Right behind her was Co, trying to get his ox cart as far up the tight trail as he could.
"You weren't messing around this time, huh?"
said Emily, taking in the velvet red splatter in the snow at Jesse's feet.
"Ain't gonna lie, I'm glad this one was faster. Of the 2 brothers, John was a nicer one."
She moved closer and began to tie a rope to the horn of John's saddle. Once secure, she tossed the other end of the rope to Jesse.
"Here, tie this around his ankles. We'll drag him down to the car."
Doing as he was instructed, Jesse tied the rope to John's limp ankles, and then stood up to remove the tomahawk from his face. Gripping the bloodied belly of the axe, Jesse pulled hard, producing an audible crunch as the gap that had been held up by the blade collapsed into a pool of torn skin and blood. Wiping the blade on his pants, Jesse took to removing the wire from the trees before following Emily and John's horse, which were now actively dragging John's body, leaving a distinct red trail along the snowy path. Before leaving the scene, Jesse used his now slightly duller axe to cut some pine boughs and began to sweep the area to remove their footprints and cover the blood with fresh snow as he followed Emily down the path. Loading up the body into the cart was a relief. They had a shorter ride to the burial ground this time, and they would soon get a chance at some well-deserved rest. As the cart bobbed through the snow and dirt of China Basin, Jesse pulled out his Bible once again and flipped to the last page. Hands shaking with exhaustion, he crossed out 2 more names on his list: Jim and John O'Keely. The impending things are hastening upon them. Chapter 33. Atlanta Chapel, December 29th, 1867. The stress and long nights had taken their toll, and Jesse feared that fatigue may cloud his judgment in planning for the final execution on his list. He knew that in order to send the right message from God, his attack on Earl Cumming had to be brutal and eloquent in his delivery. To ensure that everyone was in top cognitive shape, the crew retired to their respective dwellings and caught up on some much-needed rest after they had dumped the body of John O'Keely. For Jesse, getting to sleep took longer than he expected. As he lay in his bed at the top of the sanctuary, he couldn't help but feel anxious at the thought of being caught and not having the ability to finish his mission. Yet, he knew that God was on his side, and that was the only peace that eventually brought him to slumber. After a solid 14 hours of a near coma, Jesse arose to go about his business around town before returning to the church for his Sunday sermon. His motivation for meandering before his 10 o'clock service on the day was twofold. One, he wanted to get out, reset his brain, and partake in activities that didn't require a murderous hand. And two, he wanted to see whether any gossip had started to circulate about the cluster of missing scoundrels. On his walkabout, Jesse was planning to stop by the apothecary to check in on Co, but as he made the turn onto Main Street, he was stopped by the sound of a deep voice calling out his name. At first, it caught Jesse off guard as his awareness was on high alert. But quickly his brain fired the proper amount of synapses to indicate that this voice was a friendly one.
Jesse Waite, I wasn't sure you'd be dead or run off by now.
Turning to the buckskin-covered man, Jesse replied, Eustace, I didn't think I would be seeing you till spring.
Hey, well, that should have been the truth, but old Mr. Cumming sent word out a month back that he paid double for anyone willing to bring the mail over the hills before the new year. Guess he was expecting some news from investors back east,
Eustace said.
Anywho, I took the last week to work my horse and mules over and ran my trap lines to go get some of that prime winter fur. Thankfully, the snows ain't been too bad yet, but if my horse could talk, I bet he'd have a different opinion.
Eustace added, tickled at his own joke and launching into that old belly-busting laugh Jesse had nearly forgotten about.
So, Jesse, I heard from Mr. Cumming that you got your church up and running. You say you caused some trouble letting them coolies and Negroes in, but he claims he set you straight. Hope that old coot and his boys didn't do too much damage.
Jesse gave a sly smile at the thought of the chaos the O'Keelys had injected into his sanctuary. Nah, Eustace, they didn't do too much damage, Jesse replied. Rough fellas, but I reckon they just need a little more exposure to the power of God to set them straight.
I hear you, Jesse. There's gotta be one powerful God to set them boys right. Come to think of it, though, I ain't seen neither of them when I was over with Mr. Cumming.
Well, Eustace, God is powerful. Glad to see you. You should come to the church today before you leave town. As Eustace turned to head back to the postal office, he let out another little chuckle.
Oh, hell, Jesse, I can't be having lightning strike that pretty building of yours and burn it to the ground, he said. Hey, say, I got something for you.
Waddling over to one of his mules hitched up in front of the postal building, Eustace plunged his paw into one of the saddlebags. Digging around, he bit his bottom lip before emerging with a small figurine in his hand.
This here's a barred owl that I've been whittling on for the last few months. Got the inspiration for it on our last trip over while we was sitting at Corpus Lake. These things are said to bring protection. Figure you should have it.
Tossing the figurine to Jesse, Eustace gave a tip of his hat, and with a big toothless smile, he turned to head toward his waiting horse and mules. The chance run-in with his friend made Jesse start to think about what was next. What would happen once he killed Mr. Cumming? Surely word would eventually get out, and if it did, town justice would be different for him than it was for Tristan. Killing the man who funded half the town would mean cutting off the money flow, and that was never a good way to make friends. He began to think that he may have to leave town once this is all over with, maybe continue his crusade somewhere else. Yet, if he were to leave this winter, his window was closing, and Eustace had just confirmed the treachery of the surrounding mountains. These thoughts swirled as Jesse continued his early morning walk downtown. Co seemed perfectly rested and content with the acts they had committed, and after checking in on him with his apothecary, Jesse got the gumption to head over to the Atlanta Hotel to see Mr. Cumming. As he walked in, he saw Mr. Cumming sitting at the desk in the back with the main hall, with his ear trumpet resting on his side. He looked tired himself, and was feverishly shuffling through the mail Eustace had brought over to him for a steep price. As he looked up and saw Jesse approaching, he propped his ear trumpet on the table in anticipation of a conversation. As Jesse leaned forward to yell into the long tube, he began. "Hello there, Mr. Cumming. What a nice Sunday, eh? Well, I'll be seeing you at church in the next hour."
Hell you and your church, Jesse. I got some more important things today. Unless your God can help smite some creditors back east, I ain't interested.
Jesse couldn't help but smile. "No, Mr. Cumming, I don't think he can help you there," he said. "His smiting is usually reserved for the worst of the worst. Not sure a banker would measure up." Old Mr. Cumming sneered and waved Jesse off, to which Jesse obliged and turned to leave. But as he was just a few steps away, his ego got the better of him, and he turned and hollered loudly toward the still propped ear trumpet. "Say, where are the O'Keefe boys? I haven't seen them around this morning. Think they'll be in church?" Taking a moment to process the question, Mr. Cumming raised his overgrown, white eyebrows and replied,
"Those lazy sumbitches is out and about somewhere, probably hunting or something. They ain't told me they was leaving either. So if they are back in time for church, they begin an ass tune from me, not a pep talk from you and your God."
Jesse lifted his hand in a gesture of understanding, and slightly bowed his head in reverence as he turned to leave. As soon as his feet were past the threshold of the hotel entrance and back on the snow-covered street, a smile stretched across his face, and he turned to head home and prepare for his final sermon. As people began filing into the church adorned in their heavy winter attire, Jesse stood at the altar and reveled in the inadvertent joy he had brought the town. Walter Frank's family had given up on the search for their abusive patriarch, and seemed to be just a little more lively, and much less bruised, in the front pew. The rest of the congregation also seemed more loose and open, for once Jesse began to preach, there was no omnipresent judgment coming from the O'Keefe enforcers in the back of the sanctuary. In Jesse's mind, this was peace, and a part of God's divine will to bring tranquility to this town, who had known nothing but violence, and God's plan seemed to be working. That feeling of reassurance gave an extra zest to the words Jesse spoke to his congregation. He reminded them of the importance of obedience to God, for the God they praised was an angry one that was unafraid to levy consequences on the unrepentant sinner. In closing, Jesse turned his Bible to the book of Job and flipped the yellowed and blood-speckled pages to chapter 4, verse 9, and read, "At the breath of God they perish. At the blast of his anger they are no more." Chapter 34, Atlanta Chapel, December 30th, 1867. The day after his sermon, Jesse was eager to meet with Coe and Dutch M. They had planned to gather in the church in broad daylight to stoke the ire of Mr. Cumming. It was a stretch, but the crew did not have many options for drawing Mr. Cumming out of his hotel. Killing him in his own establishment in the heart of downtown would be too risky, and they knew he would be enraged at the thought of such lowly folks like Coe and M using the church. So they decided they would bait him and wait. They knew he would eventually waddle over to the church to give Jesse a piece of his mind. The problem was that they could not predict the timing of it, especially since the O'Keefes had disappeared and wouldn't be there to protect him. Nonetheless, once Coe and M did show up, there was plenty of planning to do in preparation for Jesse's inevitable encounter with Earl Cumming. "Right, so what's your plan once you take him out?" Dutch M barked as she made her way to the front pew to sit by Jesse. "I don't know, Emily. I've been praying hard on that. I don't think I can stay here long. In fact, the thought of owing this man money made me despise the means in which I built this sanctuary."
"So you will leave us?"
Coe cut in from his seated position on the floor.
"I would hate to see you go after all you have done to help rid this town of so much filth. If you need more work, I can give it to you."
"That's not it, Coe," said Jesse. "I just think God is done with me. I prayed for guidance and he came through, and now I feel called to the next town, to keep the cleansing going, provide protection for those who can't defend themselves against tyrants." "I don't want to be the devil's advocate here, but how do you plan to pull off more of God's work without Coe or me to help?" Emily asked, perturbed by Jesse's words. "I ain't saying you can't, but without us, you'll be dead before long." Emily had a point, and Jesse knew it. "I understand that, and I appreciate everything you two have done to help me serve God," he said. "But I just can't ask you to leave. I don't even know where I'll go yet. I don't know what jobs are there, and traveling in the middle of winter is too dangerous. Co nodded in silent agreement, while Emily joked that she could find work anywhere she went. As the conversation stalled and the realization set in that soon they'd go their separate ways, they buried their emotions in preparation. Together, the three decided how Jesse would kill Earl Cumming when he made his way into the sanctuary. They agreed on a specific signal to mark the occasion. The signal would be seen throughout the entire town. It would serve as an indicator to Co and Emily that the town's biggest tormentor was no more, and they would know that Jesse was off to wherever God was pulling him next. For now, all there was left to do was to go about their normal business and wait for Mr. Cumming to see himself to his own funeral. Chapter 35. Atlanta Chapel. December to January, 1868. Jesse had been keeping his hands busy after his final meeting with Co and Emily. He had made up his mind that once he killed Earl Cumming, he would take off on his horse and head west along the Boise River. He had heard from Eustis that there seemed to be trouble brewing in the OIE mining districts, which seemed like a potentially fine destination that latently occupied the back of Jesse's mind. In preparation for his impending departure, Jesse packed what few belongings he had and piled them to the front door of his church. Once the act was done, he would soon leave town post-haste in order to avoid any suspicion or risk of capture by Sheriff Hott. He was ready. As planned, Jesse spent his time inviting the town's lowlifes into the sanctuary each day. Emily helped bring in the whores who sought redemption, Co brought Taoists, and Jesse extended formal invites to the Templetons and a few Mexicans who had set up shop on the outskirts of town. Jesse knew this constant stream of fellowship seekers would elicit gossip. Their fellowshipping ways over those few days, which Jesse truly enjoyed, had its desired effect, and soon the town was awash with a buzz that was bound to swirl into the bronze-eared trumpet of Mr. Cumming. It took a couple of days, but on the morning of New Year's Day, 1868, the final piece of the puzzle slipped into place as the doddering old Mr. Cumming pushed the door to the sanctuary open and crossed the threshold into his own tomb. Without his henchmen, Earl was much less intimidating. In fact, as Jesse began to work his way down from his loft to greet his visitor, the old man's struggled steps made Jesse feel briefly empathetic. Those thoughts quickly abated, however, the second Earl opened his mouth and began yelling from the back pew, which he was now bracing himself against.
Jesse, wait, what in the hell do you think you're doing, inviting these scums into my establishment? Did John and Jim not teach you a good enough lesson? I swear, once they're back, I'm going to have them work you over real good so you don't forget who owns this place.
The anger and vitriol the old man spewed out left him panting, and he was forced to hunker over the pew to catch his breath. With the effort he had exerted, he likely expected to see fear and understanding in Jesse's eyes when he approached. But as Jesse came closer, Earl saw something different in Jesse's eyes. He was no longer looking at a meek and mild-mannered preacher who could be seen pushed around with no fear of retribution. Instead, he saw a man made of steel with an air of kinetic punishment. Jesse didn't say a word as he made his way toward Earl Cumming, and he could see the fear growing in the old man's eyes. In silence, Jesse walked right past him and went to shut the front door of the church. Earl turned around, still bracing his frail body against the sturdy wooden frame of the back pew, and watched as Jesse picked up a white rag and poured liquid onto it from a brown bottle. Jesse then turned toward Earl and began a confident and deliberate approach.
Listen, Jesse, you don't want to mess with me, Mr. Cumming said then, his voice labored and thin. You hurt me, and you're dead. The money will be gone, and I'll burn this place to the ground. You hear me?
The hollow threats bounced off of Jesse's holy armor as he moved closer to the desperate man. Earl, Jesse began, ice cold and detached. They're all dead. Walter, Tristan, John, and Jim, smited by the hammer of God. Me. Your threats mean nothing, and your actions are ripe for retribution. You are going to die today, and it will be slow. At the realization of the words Jesse spoke, the cowardice that had always lurked beneath the old man's fearless facade broke free, as did the control of his bladder, and he urinated on himself as his pupils dilated in fear. Jesse lifted the rag and held it to the old man's face as he tried in vain to struggle free, before dropping to the floor like a moldy sack of soft potatoes. Once Earl was unconscious, Jesse unfurled the blanket that he had stashed on the back pew. He spread it on the ground beside the troll-like body of Mr. Cumming and rolled him onto it. Grabbing both ends of the blanket near his victim's head, he began to drag him toward the altar. Jesse was disgusted by the smell of piss, but knew there would be small tests of his patience along the way, so he simply shook the thought of it out of his mind. He reached under Earl's arms and pulled him up to the 3 small steps of the platform that overlooked the congregation's seating. Once on the platform, it was a short push of the body to prop Earl up directly under the giant cross. Satisfied with his positioning, Jesse went to fetch the tall ladder that would reach all the way to the second-story rafters. Before making the climb, Jesse grabbed the snake-like coil of rope that was laying on the front pew. With cat-like dexterity, he made his way to within 2 feet of the top rafter of the church, hucked the noose end of the rope over the beam, and then lowered it down until the noose was nearly in the lap of the unconscious man below. Jesse let the ladder up and scurried down to start his next task, which was tying a gag around Earl's mouth, so when the chloroform wore off, Earl wouldn't be able to scream. Once the gag was in place, Jesse stripped the old man of all his clothes, leaving his wrinkly and sporadically hairy body exposed under the watchful eye of God. Jesse then bound both his hands and feet with shorter pieces of rope, and took a seat on the front pew to pray and meditate as he waited for the old man to wake up. Roughly 30 minutes passed before Earl's mold-covered eyes began to blink, and he was brought back to the reality of his situation. Jesse sat and watched as the man's eyes darted around the room and then landed on his own naked and loose-skinned body, before looking up at the noose Jesse had been left dangling a foot above his head. Earl's first instinct was a writhing kick, but the ropes around his feet and hands gave his aged body limited mobility, and he quickly stopped. It seemed as though Earl had relented and accepted his fate, that perhaps he was glad his death would be a quick one by hanging. However, as Jesse stood and approached the pathetic mastermind of so much misery and began to speak, any semblance of relief Earl might have felt was cut short. "I hope you had a nice nap," Jesse said, "because for the rest of your time on this earth you are going to suffer." Jesse then grabbed the noose hanging above Earl's head, which made him flinch. As he lowered the rope and began to work it around the naked man's head, Earl closed his eyes as he waited for the noose to tighten. But after the rope passed over his eyes, it kept moving down. Jesse wasn't putting the noose around his neck, but under his arms and around his chest. Confused, Earl's eyes grew wide again, and his heart rate quickened as curiosity and fear overtook him. Once the rope was secured under Mr. Cumming's bound arms, Jesse left the altar and walked over to the other end of the rope, which was running through a pulley Jesse had attached to the floor. Without a word, he removed the slack in the rope and then pulled hard to start lifting the portly old man off the floor. As Jesse leaned hard into the rope, the noose began to tighten around Earl's chest and immediately broke 2 of his fragile ribs, and he screamed out in agony through his gag. His head reared back in pain, sending his body into a spin as Jesse continued to raise him higher and higher off the floor. Jesse tied off the rope on one of the floor's support beams when Earl's chest was in line with the center of the sanctuary's cross. He grabbed 3 nails and a hammer and climbed the ladder for a second time. As he reached the top rung, he was but a foot away from the disgusting hobbit that still spun from the rope. Jesse grabbed Earl's bound hands to stop the spin, and then pulled out his knife and cut the restraints loose. It was clear Earl had grown too pained and weak to resist as Jesse proceeded to pull Earl's right hand out wide, so that it was parallel with the horizontal beam of the cross. With surgical speed and precision, he took a 6-inch steel nail and drove it through Earl's wrist, pinning his arm to the cross. The pain eclipsed that of his broken ribs, and Earl kicked like a donkey before ultimately passing out, his head falling limp, and supported by only the fat rolls under his chin. Jesse stepped down the ladder a few rungs. He drove a single nail between both of Earl's ankles and into the main beam of the cross. He then shimmied the rest of the way down, moving the ladder to Earl's left side, and repeated the process of nailing his other arm to the cross. While Mr. Cumming was still passed out, Jesse descended once more down the ladder, piled the stack of wood at the base of the cross, and soaked it in kerosene. Working back to the front pew, Jesse grabbed a nail and a small, opaque bottle, and then turned to the last page in his Bible and ripped it out, With his loot in hand, he scaled the ladder one last time to awaken the unconscious old man. Reaching over to tilt open his mouth, Jesse then poured in the contents of a bottle he had secured from Co., a mixture of cocaine and heroin. Holding his mouth shut, he waited for a few seconds until he once again saw Earl's eyes shoot open in terror. "I wouldn't want you to miss it," Jesse said as he stapled the last page of his Bible to Earl's sternum with his slender brad nail. Making defiant eye contact with the weeping old man, Jesse disembarked from the ladder one last time, pulled a box of matches from his pocket, struck one, and threw it on the pile of kerosene-soaked wood at the base of the cross. At the realization of what Jesse had done, Earl made a final attempt to break free by craning his neck, but the nails in his extremities prevented him from moving. As Jesse walked toward the front door of the church, he could hear the crackling of the fire grow gradually louder, drowning out the muffled cries of the crucified Mr. Cumming. When Jesse reached the door, he turned around and took stock of the scene before grabbing his belongings and walking out to hop in the saddle of his waiting horse. As Jesse made his way past the Greenback mine and over towards China Basin, he looked back to see smoke rising in vindictive plumes just a mile away. As his horse galloped across the shallow Boys River, Jesse heard a high-pitched whistle coming from behind him. When he turned to look, he caught sight of a female form riding at full speed in his direction. It was Dutch M. Jesse pulled back on his reins and signaled his horse to stop, and as Emily approached, he saw that she was riding with John O'Keely's horse. "I reckon you need someone to keep an eye out for you as you continue your crusade," she said. "I ain't got nothing here but bad memories and a no-good job. I figure if your God called you to do all that house cleaning, then maybe there's hope for me after all." She smiled as she spoke. "Plus, Fleur said you were one hell of a man, and that's an opinion I take to heart." Though Jesse remained stoic and silent, he didn't waver off. He was secretly relieved of the companionship Emily would provide on this long and uncertain road ahead. "So, where are we off to, Jesse?" Jesse turned around in his saddle and stared back at the plume of smoke once again. "Wherever God takes us," he said. "But I figure we can point our horses toward the Hawaiis and see what trouble is brewing over there." In silent agreement, Jesse and Em turned toward the magnificent rock face of Mount Greylock, and were greeted by 3 suns shining brightly over its peak, a sundog. With that late December symbol of good luck, they spurred their horses and took off at a gallop in the shin-deep snow, leaving behind them a path of righteous destruction. This concludes The Bone Scraper by Zach Hanson. Copyright by Zach Hanson and published by Dusty Saddle Publishing, a division of DS Productions.
This concludes the story of The Bone Scraper, Book 1, The Atlanta Lode, by Zachary Hanson. We hope you have enjoyed this story. You can find more books by Zachary on Amazon, available for Kindle and in paperback. This story has been brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com. Please hit the subscribe button and leave a comment if you've enjoyed listening to this story. Till next time, happy trails!